Alive, thank you.
Justine. Yeah. Literacy update.
Yes.
Again.
Just make it big. It may be.
Okay, we are back in session and beginning our committee reports. Just to remind those that are listening and participating, we're back on our pre-COVID protocols, which are to have the committee work on Wednesday, then brief committee reports on Thursday, followed by action on items requiring action. So before we move to the committee reports, I'd just like for a moment to reflect on the great work that was done in our planning and work session last month. In particular, Dr. Hull's advice to us to stay focused on priorities despite the distractions. Stay focused on priorities despite the distractions. And today we have an opportunity to move forward on all three of our priorities: eliminating opportunity gaps, improving school and district performance, and improving educator preparedness in the items before us that we're taking action on. And I'm also reminded of the report that we heard from Dr. Jackson and the emphasis on all means all students and our focus on equity in the whole child and every student. So with that, we'll begin our committee reports, and I'll remind committee chairs in the audience that all voting on consent and any items requiring action will be done at the end of this agenda via roll call. We'll begin with the Business Operations Committee chaired by Vice Chair Duncan. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Chair Davis. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of my friend Todd Chastain, we provide the Business Operations Committee services for the board, and very pleased to make this quick report. I want to stop, if I could, with one brief observation as we start. I was struck by our principal of the year used the word, I thought was valuable, how valuable our educators, our teachers and principals were during this pandemic and how we learned from them. The person who writes the script caught the word as malleable and may well have been what was said. And I was struck by it, that truth of the matter is that you don't think of those two terms in the same way, but truthfully, that's exactly what happened. Our educators were incredibly valuable, and they were incredibly malleable in order to be so valuable in this past year. So it was it just struck me, just so many different ways to describe the contributions of our educators this year. It's been a great morning celebrating that. Our first item that we discussed in committee is approval of contracts over $500,000. We had 8 of those this month, following 12 last month. And we had great reports from Dr. Wren, Dr. Sandberg, Dr. Tomberlin, Ms. Townsend, and Ms. Schott Coltrane on these several contracts, which covered 8 topics: the applicant tracking system, the College Board North Carolina Advanced Placement Partnership, Canvas infrastructure, the EBSCO amendment, the Encyclopedia Britannica amendment, both of which go to resources, the Open Education Resources Solution amendment, which again goes to resources for use in our schools. Our workers' compensation renewal, which is critical for protection of our employees. And finally, our annual contract with EVAS data through SAS. We have a ninth contract to add that we did not discuss yesterday. So very briefly, let me cover the ninth contract that we will discuss just from a contractual basis. I believe Ms. Camus will say something further about this more substantively about this contract in her committee report. The Office of Early Learning has come to us with a recommendation that a K through 3 formative and diagnostic reading assessment statewide solution proposal to fulfill the Read to Achieve legislative requirements. And so this came about after a lot of hard work by a lot of people. There was a stakeholder team prepared by the department on behalf of the department. That team was made up of 9 voting members, 6 of whom are from the field: a superintendent, 2 elementary teachers, chief academic officer, a member of an EC staff in the field, and a principal in the field. Then 3 members from the department, 2 DPI early literacy consultants and a DPI early learning director. This team was led by Dr. Amy Ryan and Dr. David Stegall, and we give great thanks to all the members of the team, and both to Dr. Ryan and to Dr. Stegall. I also want to point out there were several non-voting team members in order to support the work of the team, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but many members of both the field from charter schools and from institutes of higher learning and other support from the various LEAs were involved, as well as a very strong support from DPI staff in areas of importance. So we give thanks for the work that got put into all this. It just does not happen easily. The contract is a proposed 3-year contract. The original amount for year 1 is $8,734,000. That covers the annual amount for the service of $2,897,500 and all the materials that are necessary. That is all the support materials and actual materials that are necessary in order to support the project and have it set up in the initial year, and the training and other support. So year 2 will be the same $2,897,500, and the year 3 would be the same amount again. So the total amount of the contract over a 3-year period would be $14,529,000. For a reference, that's comparable to what we had paid when we had a single source contract 2 years ago. The contract would be with Amplify, which is a vendor that many in the state are familiar with because many districts have dealt with this particular assessment tool in the past. Others have used other assessment tools as well. In the past year, our districts have had 5 assessment tools. This now moves it to 1 assessment tool statewide. It's worth saying one word about that, I think, or one sentence about that, which is, I know many of our districts have enjoyed the ability to have flexibility in selecting a tool. Problem is, from the legislation, we are charged with being able to develop statewide data, and with a multiplicity of tools, you're not able to put together statewide data in a comprehensive form. I know our friends at SAS have worked very hard on that, and it's just not able to put together the data in a way that we can report it out statewide in the way that's required by the legislation, and then a way that will provide data that will help guide ongoing work by the department in terms of how to best assess the needs of our students and what programs that are in place that are working well. So that's enough about the contract from my limited business committee standpoint. The recommendation is that it's asked that the State Board of Education approve the 2021-2022 K-3 formative and diagnostic reading assessment provided by Amplify Education, Inc. That will be the 9th contract on contracts over $500,000 in BizOp number 1. And you will hear more articulately about it shortly from Ms. Kamnitz. We now move on to BizOp 2, which is the American Rescue Plan Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund application template. Dr. Maha reported to us that with respect to the template, 2/3 of the funding was already provided and has already been distributed appropriately. There's a remaining 1/3 of the fund to which North Carolina has been awarded under the federal legislation. It's necessary to have an application made by each state and a template for how those funds will be used, which Dr. Maher and his colleagues have been working very hard on. And so we are here being asked to approve the proposed template that may be modified some further because public comment's still in process, as we were informed. And we will move to a final approval shortly before the date of the submission, which I believe, by memory, is June 21st. I think that's right. Finally, or not finally, but next as an action on first read, and all these actions so far in action on first read is a policy amendment for the state board on the American Rescue Plan Homeless One grant program. Very important program for our many homeless students around the state. Very important support. John Kiefer reported to us on how this grant program is to be set up and how it's to be administered and what the guidelines should be for it so that we can put in place an allotment policy for use of those funds. BizOp 4 is again a state board policy amendment for K through 5 program enhancement teachers. I think everyone will recall Ms. Schaus provided us a report with the effective legislation goes back to 2018 with the class reduction legislation that caused some changes in the number of teachers that were necessary as you lowered the class size in these key grades, K through 3 in particular. And as a result of that, there was some additional funding. And so we have transitioned through a 3-year period. We're now at the last or 4th year of that transition, at which point it's necessary to change our allotment policy to make it clear how those funds will be allotted for our program and enhancement teachers, as was explained to us, and we would be approving that new allotment policy. All right, for action, not items we've already had discussion on, we have 4 items. BizOp 5 is the federal grants policy update. John Kiefer again reported to us, and John gave us a pretty thorough review of what the high points would be on a what I'll call relatively regular update. I believe it was a holistic update is the word that was used to it's modernized language in some things, eliminate some things that no longer exist, and use the proper reference points for our federal grants policy allotments. And so that's a procedural matter done periodically. It's an important one because there have been changes. And as we all know, federal grants have played a prominent role in activities we've been involved in the last year or two as a board. So that's up for approval. BizOp 6 is the elementary and secondary school emergency relief budget considerations. You recall Dr. Maher reported on this along with Dr. Townsend, Ms. Rousseau from our internal auditor, and Ms. Schaus at our special meeting last week. And Dr. Maher was available again along with Ms. Schaus yesterday for additional questions. This is a total of approximately $10.7 million and for 24 positions that will be, I think we refer to it as the backbone of our efforts through some of these ESSER fundings. And so these are very important positions. They would go through September 30 of 2024. And I did want to read the recommendation. It's been revised somewhat after our discussion yesterday. So I'm going to read the recommendation for the board so you know what you'll be voting for directly on this. It's recommended that the State Board of Education approve the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, ESSER 3 budget considerations positions. And see, DPI reflects flexibility to manage the expenditures of these positions within the administration funds of ESSER 1, 2, and 3. State Board provides flexibility to the department to modify the classifications within each budget to meet the needs of administering the funds. The State Board of Education will receive consistent updates with respect to how these funds will be administered in light of the flexibility that's provided. So that will be the recommendation being voted on that provides, key point, provides flexibility needed. BizOp 7 is approval of elementary and secondary school emergency relief. That's ESSER 1 funding for $500,000. And you will recall Ms. Schaus reported that this was a transfer of $50,000 that was originally allocated for posters to instead go to the contract to make up $50,000 of the $500,000 contract with Duke Medical Center for information that's been provided and support during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Op 8 is the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER 2. We've hit all three of them multiple times. But ESSER 2, which is for the North Carolina Virtual Public Schools budget for summer programming, particularly focused on grades 9 through 12. This summer, Dr. Rachel McBroom informed the board of what was being done and has provided a report and some further information yesterday. This is use of ESSER 2 funds of approximately $2 million. It's authorized under the funding that's allowed under ESSER 2, and will be done with courses that have the appropriate certifications that a subject of some question. We had for the board available the updates on contracts for executed contracts report and planned contracts report. I think all have had the opportunity to review those. Our agency vacancy report, Mr. Paxton provided us with a brief but helpful update in terms of what it looks like in filling positions, how we're going through the transformation of some changes in the structure of the department under Superintendent Truitt's leadership, and how that's being accomplished, and how the vacancies are being handled, and how new positions, in part being obviously funded through something we're going to vote on today as a 3 budget consideration. We will receive, Dr. Mahar indicated we would receive ESSER 1, 2, and 3 comprehensive plan updates on a regular basis, and in a sense received one this month because we covered all 3 of them in different ways. But we will set as a regular part of our BizOp report reports on that. We also had an excellent presentation by Ms. Schaus in terms of starting to take the budget in digestible chunks. And we had our tutorial on the CPI budget broken down between state funding and federal funding, all of which is it's different than our funding that's just allocated out to the districts. And so we had a very helpful and thorough discussion in terms of where that funding comes from, how it's divided, and how the department is paid for, if you will, between state funding, federal funding, and other revenue sources. We will continue in that series, and July is a short meeting, so we'll continue in August when we can budget from the previous year. Finally, we had 2 consent items. One is the relatively standard appointment of new finance officers in 2 districts. The last one is our annual report on start dates and finish dates for school districts around the state and for schools, which goes to the JLEOC. That concludes our report, Mr. Chair, and if there's any questions, we're glad to deal with those.
Any questions on the Business Operations Committee report? Hearing none, thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. We'll now move to our next report, which is Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools, chaired by Ms. Amy White. Ms. White.
Thank you, Chair Davis. I am Amy White. I'm the chair of the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee. Share that responsibility with Jill Kamnitz. We had a great discussion yesterday during our committee meeting. For action and your consideration today, we have 3 items. EICS 1 is the 2020 Charter School Annual Report, and that is a report that's due to the Joint Education Legislative Oversight Committee every year. This year, the report is due on June 15th. We had that presentation last month. Board members submitted lots of questions, excellent dialogue, interacted with the Office of Charter School staff, get some of those finer data points addressed. And so that report is complete and will be submitted mid-month to that committee. EICS 2 was a request from Wake Preparatory Academy to relocate from its original charter location in Wake County to a tract of land in Franklin County. Quite a bit of discussion about this particular item. We learned during that process that Franklin County is under a desegregation order, and through a series of questions asked by board members, we amended the original motion to include the statutory requirement for charter schools that basically within 1 year of their operation, they must be comparison, in demographics, both race and economic, disadvantaged students. Within 1 year, they must be comparable to the LEA. And also, that the school comply with the desegregation order that's been offered by the courts. We use that language to make some minor changes to the charter agreement in between, the school board and Wake Prep. And so that's before you for approval. EICS 3 is a request from Movement School Eastland to increase its enrollment. As you know, when there's an increase above a certain percentage, it must come back before the state school board for approval. This is actually a total increase of only 35 students. The school is in Mecklenburg County. The recommendation was approved by CSAB and is before us for approval as well. Then we have several discussion items. EICS 4 was a presentation by the Office of Charter Schools, and this was a preliminary recommendation for schools that are going to be ready to open. They were not quite ready to make that recommendation final. Those final recommendations will come before us in July. There are a few items that they are tidying up with some additional meetings this month, but we should receive the final list at our July meeting for the ready to open recommendations for new charter schools in the state of North Carolina. EICS 5 was a great presentation by Jay Whalen for sub-grantee recommendations for the North Carolina Access Grant. One of the most interesting things that came out of the presentation was the distinction between a planning grant, a planning and implementation grant, a replication grant, and how those funds are allocated based on the requests that are made. It's a very competitive process, and we are excited about a report that will come out of Mr. Whalen's team later this year that will give us an update on the impact of that grant on the charter schools that have implemented those funds to provide more equitable access to our most economically disadvantaged students who choose to attend a charter school in the state of North Carolina. EICS 6 was a presentation on a proposal to revise the 2022 charter school application timeline and process. For several years, we have talked about providing an outlet for charter school applicants to have an earlier approval time so that they have more planning time from the time in which the school is actually approved to the time in which the school opens. Those minor revisions were heard yesterday for discussion. Encourage you to reach out to the Office of Charter Schools if you have questions about those minor changes. That will be back before us for action next month. EICS 7 was Doral Academy, North Carolina's request to implement a weighted lottery and revise its enrollment projections due to some facility constraints and availability of facility once the charter was actually acquired. They are reducing their numbers for the time being until the facility can be upfitted and expanded. And they also are going to use funds from the Access Grant to implement a weighted lottery. We're excited about that. EICS 8, that's a discussion item. Come back for us next month. EICS 8 is Coastal Prep Academy's request to partner with an EMO, and that EMO was Charter One, who has a multi-state impact with charter schools across our nation. EICS 9, it's Asheville Peak Charter Academy's request to revise its enrollment. This is actually a reduction in enrollment, again, because of a facility limitation. And then, Mr. Chair, we do have 2 consent items. EICS 10 is the approval of the restart application submissions that we heard multiple schools in both Guilford County and Wake County before us for approval. And then EICS 11 was Davis Academy's request to actually relinquish its charter from a number of enumerated reasons. That concludes our committee report. Thank you for your time today.
Any questions on the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools report? Hearing none, just to build on one point on EICS 2, while the law does not mandate that the charter school actually achieve comparable demographics, it does mandate that there be efforts made to achieve comparable demographics in the school. And that's the language that we've incorporated, as you stated, Ms. White.
Thank you for the excellent clarification.
Okay, we'll now move to the Healthy Responsible Students Report, and I'll call on the chair of that committee, Mr. Reginald Keenan. Mr.
Thank you,
Keenan.
Mr. Chair. Of course, I'm Reginald Keenan and co-chair of HRS committee, along with my good friend, Vice Chair, Mr. Alden Duncan. And we had two items we talked about yesterday, one for new business, and that was for the Say Something Anonymous reporting system, the app, which you know by statute required to have safety app. And of course, according to our presenters, we had Dr. Robert Taylor yesterday and Ms. Karen Furley and also Mr. Michael Anderson, I think it is. And they gave data as to the number of tips that's been involved since the installation of the app, the Say Something app. And to date, there's 90 NC public school units that are using the Say Something platform, with about 16 LEAs, 15 traditional and non-traditional. And the 141 charter schools currently using the platform. From May 1st, 2020 through April the 30th, 2021, the platform received 1,671 tips. The total number of tips received from November the 4th, 2019 until April the 30th, 2021 is 5,480. Also discussed in the presentation was information as to the what were some of the main tips. It seemed like bullying and cyberbullying was always seemed to be the number one rank as far as the type tips that have been received. And also you have, as you know, non-life threatening situation and life-threatening situations tips. But from all the data that comes down to what I think it was said yesterday about the data really just shows that the need that we need the extra psychologists, we need extra social workers because of if it's one child, that's still one too many. And so there's, as I mentioned, there's some of the schools have opted out of the platform, and for different reasons. But the fact is, they still have to have the app that's required by statute. So with that, it's ongoing. It's ongoing, and they've been still working with teachers and administrators to be on board with the program. So that's basically the summarize of what we talked about yesterday in that particular matter. And then, of course, for the second matter for discussion was the modification of the middle school athletic manual, which must be done each year. And of course, there were three changes made, and they were not very, what I say, major changes. And let me have 1 second here, and I will. There was more of just a date and name change, but nothing of major substance on that. And with that, we conclude the presentation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any questions on Healthy Responsible Students Report? Thank you, Mr. Keenan. We'll now move to the Educator Standards and Practice Committee report, chaired by Dr. Olivia Oxendine. Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Chair Davis. I am Olivia Oxendine. I chair this committee, and joining me in that responsibility is Miss Amy White. I'm going to do a quick but a thorough update on the items that were presented yesterday in the first day meeting of the State Board of Education. Under ES&P, item ES&P1, which is an action on first reading, this information relative to an appeal for an additional year to complete licensure requirements was thoroughly discussed yesterday in closed session. Based on the vote of the Extenuating Circumstances Committee, I am bringing an affirmative recommendation to approve that request to the State Board of Education today. I would also like to take just a moment to recognize a member of the Extenuating Circumstances Committee. He has served on this committee for several years, And actually, his time on this committee precedes my time on the committee. He is retiring from a faculty position at Catawba College. And at one point, I believe he served as the dean of the School of Education. His name is Dr. James Stringfield. So I just want to just pause and take one brief moment to say thank you to Dr. Stringfield for his commitment and time and expertise that he has given to the ECC over many years. The next item on the agenda is ES&P 2. This was presented by Mr. Carl Logan, and he is recommending to the State Board of Education the approval of an advisory committee. And this advisory committee is made up of 19 members. And board members, in your material that you have relative to this item, you will also find a very thorough table that contains a kind of a synopsis of each person's resume. So that additional information I found very useful and very interesting, and it confirms and supports the fact that the members of this advisory committee that is representing or meeting and thinking on behalf of the driver education program, that we have high quality, well-experienced members who will be advising Mr. Logan and his team on decisions and strategies and important direction that is needed for the driver education program. The purpose of that committee contains 4 different areas that I'll briefly go through. The purpose of the North Carolina Driver Education Advisory Committee shall be to advise, make recommendations to the State Board of Education through the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction on the implementation of the driver education strategic plan and other issues related to driver education and traffic safety. The office will serve either in the person will serve in either a 2 or a 3-year seat. And that seat commences on July 1 and it terminates on July 30. The third part of the duties and responsibilities of the committee is the state board does appoint the chair of this advisory committee. So I imagine at some point in the near future that part of the purpose and responsibility will come back to the board for approval. And number 4, the role is to contribute to the direction setting of the driver education program. So board members and Chair Davis, this is coming to us today for approval. The next item, ES&P 3, is an action item. This was presented yesterday by Ms. Thomas and Ms. Bernelson, and this has to do with improving the skill sets of those who serve as interpreters in North Carolina. So we have 3 components to this as far as the recommendations that are coming to us from a stakeholder group. The first recommendation is to update the job classification for non-certified school employees. The second recommendation is to promote the voluntary implementation of the educational interpreter evaluation tool and to address the concerns of stakeholders. And the third recommendation, the final recommendation, actually has to do with when all of this should become effective. And that recommendation is for July 1, 2021, which is next month, in fact. So this is coming to us. It's an action item. It was presented in great detail last month and briefly summarized yesterday. So it's coming to us today for approval. And the last item, ES&P 4, is a discussion item. It will return to us next month for action. This was presented to us by Dr. Seiberg. It is relative to the licensing testing requirement, which is contained and explained in LIC, as far as policy that is, is contained and detailed in LINC 003. It more specifically, it has to do with the Ed TPA cut scores in legislation. GS 115C 269.25 requires a clinical pedagogical assessment. That simply means during the teacher candidate's internship year, which is sometimes called as a clinical, one or the other, and the EPP can make that decision to go with the Ed TPA pedagogical tool or the PPAT pedagogical tool. So this particular item is really a recommendation coming from the Professional Educator Preparation Standards Commission. We know it is PEPC, and the recommendation will be coming to us next month. There will be a little bit of refining to that recommendation, and the refining really has to do with the PEPC recommendation is to hold fast, not to make any changes in policy relative to the current cut score for Ed TPA. So in short, the recommendation will basically say to make no changes in the current policy around the cut score. So that will be so in other words, things will remain the same for 2020 as is 2020 and 2021. And I am sure that at some point, DPI along with Pepsi will look at data and decide to what extent the cut score needs to be revised. And also along with that decision will come some changes in policy. So that concludes my part of the agenda for June. And I am open to any questions or comments from my colleagues on the board.
Questions on the Educator Standards and Practice Committee report? Hearing none, thank you, Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you.
We'll now move to our final committee report of the day, the Student Learning and Achievement Committee, chaired by Ms. Jill Kamnitz. Ms. Kamnitz.
Thank you, Chair Davis. We heard earlier today from Onslow County about the transformative nature of teachers understanding the science of reading can have on students in a district. And it is my great pleasure to finally be able to recognize Dr. Stegall and Dr. Ryan. I'm not sure, Dr. Stegall, if you're going to just Amy's doing it, but we are going to have a literacy update that is outlining some really important steps forward in as we try to as we change our approach to reading across this state and bring us closer, our students closer to the goal of third grade reading proficiency. And so I know Amy's as happy as I am and everyone who on her team to be able to stand before us today and give us this report.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, members of the board, colleagues, stakeholders. I am super excited. And those of you who know me well, I already speak kind of quickly. So today, so that I slow down, I'm going to really rely on my notes a lot more so that I'll intentionally speak slower than I typically do because of the fact not only that I am a fast talker, but also the excitement. So just to make sure I stick with that. But my purpose here today is just to make sure that, first of all, to thank you for your patience and your support along this process. It was not a short one, and I learned I don't enjoy roller coaster rides. Got a little nauseous along the way and wanted to ever get off the ride. So I really appreciate that. But I am here to provide the early literacy update, specifically related to the RTA Read to Achieve diagnostic RFP process, as it is related to General Statute 115C 83.6, and how letters and the professional development for letters fits into that as it relates to General Statute 115C 83.3. So along the way, we've kind of kept you updated. Our goals are, our focus is always to align to the State Board of Education goals, as well as the collaborative guiding framework that was developed in our past, and continue to enhance upon that and add in our superintendent's North Star and early literacy vision, as well as what's happening with Operation Polaris. So we're always trying to stay in alignment with those pieces. As we discussed in our planning session, of course, goals without action are only dreams, or maybe just a vision. So we took the extra step of making sure that we broke down the progress and process along the way so that we were monitoring our steps to turn the goals into some sort of action. And we did that through this early literacy implementation progression model that you'll see here. We focus a lot on step one, aligning those processes, aligning our updated legislation, involving our stakeholders, making sure that what we are doing in our work across the board, as well as our funding. And from there, we move to steps 2 and 3, beginning to focus on what that looks like in the field as we move forward. So 115C 83.3 references the law naming Voyager Sopris, the letter specifically, as North Carolina Science Reading Professional Development Provider effective this year. The plan also includes, beyond what the superintendent had shared earlier with who's involved in that training, it will also include our 16 Office of Early Learning consultants, because they are based in the regional case model, managers model out in the fields, and they are the feet on the ground. So we want to make sure that there's alignment there. And then from there, we will continue to make sure that we are funding alignment. Our superintendent is also rallying for us for long-term coaches out in the field, our district implementers, if you will, similar to the Mississippi model, who only focus on science of reading support and coaching. Because we can provide the training, but the minute you step away, who's going to continue to coach? And we know what that looks like when you have multiple tasks happening at the same time in someone's life. So those science of reading implementers would be our people in the field. That would be funded with current EPSA funds. That's an additional funding source that we're looking at. That's the plan initially. She also talked about the implementation timeline. Cohort 1 will begin in July or August, pending the final contract. We're still negotiating the contract to make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's and get everything that we need in place for implementation. And then the second cohort will begin in the winter. The third cohort will begin next summer. Once we announce those cohorts today, this will allow the districts to go ahead and start planning where they were. The cohorts were decided based upon interest surveys from the district leaders. And so anyone who asked to be in cohort 1 was either in cohort 1 or 2, pending funding, and anyone who asked to be considered for later was considered for later. Ties our low performing districts, our Leandro districts, and wanted to make sure that they were receiving support as well as quickly as possible. So that took us to our sustainability plan. And as you'll see here, it's not the clearest, but basically you have your superintendent, and then you have a couple different divisions, the Office of Early Learning, as well as our curriculum instruction team and our district and transformation divisions, which will include your regional case model managers. And within those regions, you would have your regional consultants aligned with the district implementers. Voyager is listed on there because this is not a train the trainer model. We are depending on Voyager to do the training, and we're being trained along the way. But then also we provide the extra assistance as we work through that. So our next steps were steps basically within steps 4 and 5. We have been collaborating with standards curriculum instruction as well as IABs to look at how does this all fit into a continuum, because it's not just about our core. We have to meet kids where they are. So in order to meet kids where they are, we need to make sure that our standards are aligned, our literacy standards and expectations are aligned for highly effective. And I'm not referring to standard course of study, but the literacy expectations and guidelines of what good literacy and instruction looks like. And then also, what's the process by enhancing our current MTSS process where we are responding to students and their needs in tiers 2 and 3. So how do we align all those pieces? Before we can do any of that, we have to have data. So in order to have, once we have your data, then we know what children already know, coming to us with what they've already learned, and what they don't know, and we meet them where they are. So in order to have the data, we need an assessment of some sort. So this is where your formative and reading assessment is into play. And so today I'm excited to announce we have completed that process and are asking for your approval. I think Vice Chair Duncan shared just a little bit about our voting team, but I do want to, before I do anything further with the specific vendor of choice, I do want to particularly send a special thank you to these team members. They were dedicated, truly committed. They were professional. They advocated for kids across the continuum. We had representatives from across our continuum, as well as our families. It wasn't just about the students, but it was also about their families and support there. This year, Dr. Stiegel and I also worked together to create a process that would allow the RFP team members and the districts to actually nominate representatives for our team, as well as alternatives. So a special thank you to NC CASA, NC PAPA, Chief Academic Advisory Board, Teacher of the Year Group, Teacher of the Year, Title I demo teachers, and the Exceptional Children's Division for their nominations for our team members. We did not handpick those. We asked people to select a first and second choice. Thank you to the district representatives, because they didn't get paid to do this. They spent all of this extra time looking through these documents and really listening to the experts on the team and what they brought to the table. So want to make sure that they are represented there. And you have never served on one of these RFPs. Every voting and non-voting member continued their daily work. They read over 6,000 pages of documentation. They sat in at least 15 vendor demo hours of 15 hours of vendor demos, and then endless days and hours of discussions beyond that to make a final decision for the state at large. So our timeline, I think we have tried to keep you abreast of what's happening along the way, being transparent. We kicked this off and it was posted on December 30th of 2020. And then you can see all of the steps that were the process that we followed. The draft submission was sent to DIT on April 16th. A final award letter was handed to us yesterday. One key component of the RFP team, we began with this process. We began with looking at the legislation. What does the legislation say about what we need and what we're tasked to clearly understand for the purpose of this assessment? So it says that every student shall be assessed with a valid, formative, and diagnostic reading assessment made available by the state board. Data provided from the assessment shall be addressed with instructional supports and services. It must be able to yield data that can be used with EBOS. Lastly, it must address all of the following components: oral language, phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. You may recognize these components are also aligned to the science of reading. The main purpose was to find an instrument that would assess the knowledge in those 6 areas and help us understand and look for any warning signs that we may need to be aware of to make those decisions, and also look for any lowest deficit to know how to respond to instruction in a timely manner. Next piece we looked at was our criteria overview. So we had the team looked at vendor proposals, demonstrations, financial information, and reference checks. And that we rated each of these areas, each vendor in these areas, on a scale of 1 to 5. Generally speaking, did the vendor meet the business requirements and the requirements within the RFP? Little to no conformity required. Was the vendor able to provide evidence of their claims in the demonstrations? Was the product affordable or within reason? And how was the vendor's current financial standing or stability? And what did their customers have to say about them? So the other goal we had, hopefully we could find someone who had a ranking of 3 or more, 3 or above the area. And the results of the vendor, as we move forward in that process, it became very clear there was one that stood out. We rated individually, pulled those together as a group, and it was very clear. So while we were doing that, we were also, DPI was looking at how we going in with a multi-vendor environment. And while we would love autonomy, coming from a district, being out in the field, I know the importance of that. But when it came to how we can support at the state level, it became very apparent that we were slowing down in our process drastically. It was taking 8 to 10 weeks of minimum to turn around the data because of the process we had to go through. Not to mention the time that it takes to coordinate calendars with multi-vendors and speak with each vendor to stay on top of things. If you have one vendor, you typically have bi-weekly or at least monthly meetings to make sure you're on. And this was slow. It was really hard. We would have made it happen had that proven to be the best. But when we were looking at data, we were finding that not all vendors are created equal. So when we're trying to compare at the state level, it was obvious this may not be the best option moving forward. Our cons begin to outweigh our pros. And so my head wanted to say, let's go with the multi-vendor, but my heart knew that wasn't for kids and what we were trying to provide at the state level. It does not mean that a district cannot choose an alternative assessment that's approved by the state. Districts still have the autonomy to do that. They just have to purchase it. For the state level requirement, we're going to go with one vendor so that we have consistent data and much quicker turnaround time for that support. So based on all of the information I've shared today, we are recommending Amplify Education and MClass Dibbles 8th edition and TRC as the North Carolina Read to Achieve formative and diagnostic assessment tool for your consideration. MClass offers an integrated literacy system based on the science of reading and offers a suite of early literacy, universal screening, dyslexia screening, and progress monitoring assessments that measure all 6 of the Read to Achieve legislation components. They have a detailed item analysis, student grouping and lessons, parent letters, a parent portal for ongoing collaboration with your partners. We have developed a 3-year, we're actually working on a 3-year contract for your approval and the option of renewing for up to 4 to 5 years. The solution meets all legislative requirements of assessing components of reading, including pre-reading behaviors in the early grades. It also aligns with North Carolina's emphasis on aligning to the science of reading, as I've mentioned, and it would help us identify the lowest deficit to respond to instruction rapidly. Amplify has been working with us on adjusting and negotiating things that we have talked about and considered, such as the possibility of removing the MSV component to the queuing system, which is not science of reading research. Also looking at updating those level texts to align with science of reading. So they've been very, very willing and flexible in our negotiation. Furthermore, as we focus on identifying those early warning signs that lead to reading difficulties, Dibbles subtest corresponds to specific skill deficits commonly associated with dyslexia. In developing the Dibbles 8th edition, the University of Oregon Center of Teaching and Learning made significant efforts to ensure the measure is able to meet state-level screening requirements for both dyslexia and universal reading screeners, thereby helping maximize testing efficiencies. We also followed up to make sure that this will meet the needs of visually impaired students, and that was a yes. As we begin to focus on our next steps related to implementation, Amplify will provide all educators a course that they can do online independently. However, what we have set up specifically for our districts is we're asking for PSU representatives, and the representatives will be, the number of representatives per district to be trained, the trainers within their districts will be based on the ADM per district. So this is an online one-day train the trainer virtual platform. And then our 16 OEL consultants will also be trained to help support any of those PSU points of contacts that are the trainers for Amplify. Additionally, we've had other staff beyond our OEL consultants say, can we also participate in training? So we'll have our literacy consultants make sure that we offer training within DPI so that we're all speaking the common language and understand it when we're out supporting in the fields. Amplify is going to offer a total of 27 one-day remote training options for your PSU representatives that I just mentioned. I think it said May on their initial piece because we didn't know the timeline, but that will be shifted back 1 month so that districts can begin organizing their training and attending based on what's happening within their districts. PSU Train the Trainer representatives, as I mentioned, will be based on student population, and we will continue to support as needed in our alignment. And you'll see here the breakdown of how many PSU representatives are able to be trained. It's also something we negotiated. So moving forward, if approved today, our next steps would include sharing a memo with our district superintendents, chief academic officers, and Read to Achieve contacts, schedule a meeting with Amplify to begin reviewing their training plan, updating any other negotiation pieces that we need to work on, and our weekly scope of work meetings that for the rigorous plans that are ahead. And then with the updated RTA legislation with Science of Reading PD and the assessment alignment process that Amplify offers as a means to collect specific data per legislation, we're excited for the opportunities that lie ahead. Questions?
Questions for Dr. Ryan?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Well, Dr. Ryan, thank you so much. I really appreciate just the thoroughness and with your team and really looking at all of the vendors and really trying to think about what's best for students. Just from the field, I will say that using this program and knowing how important it is to have data that really provides you what students need and really driving instruction is so, so important. So I appreciate everything you presented today and just look forward to the plan that you have outlined. So thank you.
Other questions? Here we go.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Continuing on with the work that we did in committee yesterday, our second item of new business was an update on the Rethink Grant by Dr. Emery. This is a 17, almost $18 million grant that the department received in September 1920. Amazingly, right in the middle of the height of the pandemic and the complicated planning that was going on, they somehow found the time to apply for this very valuable grant, and things are getting rolling now. The purpose of the grant is to identify innovative instructional approaches to better meet student needs during disruptions in schooling. And that certainly is timely with the year that we've just had, but we will be much better prepared in the future for broader disruptions, hopefully not like this one, but also for those instances that happen all the time when students find that they, for whatever reason, cannot attend school. And we will now be able to provide, as a result of this work, a much richer experience for those students. So it's very exciting, and we've learned a lot this year, and I think that's going to help inform the work of this grant. 5 actions on first read. The first is the SLA1, the K-12 Social Studies Crosswalk, Strand Maps, and K-5 Unpacking Documents. Just to give a little background, according to board policy, after the standards were approved in February, the social studies team and Superintendent Truitt went to work to develop a series of supporting documents which can be used as guidance and resources for our teachers across the state. And that's, we're seeing most of those documents today for approval. We are reviewing these documents because the board asked, upon approval of the standards, the board asked to have these documents come back to us for approval and suggestions and scrutiny. So the documents are coming to us for that purpose today. Dr. Carlin walked us through the process that the staff has used to develop these documents and also helped us understand how districts might use these documents in preparing to be ready for the new standards this fall. She emphasized that it is up to districts to choose their own curricula to meet these needs, and it is a matter of choice for districts and teachers in how they use the supporting documents. They are there for their resource and support only. So no requirements there, and so I would want to clarify that a slight difference to what we heard yesterday. Today, the recommendation is that the state board approve the K-12 Social Studies Crosswalk, Strand Maps, and K-5 Unpacking Documents. The glossary will be presented next month with the 6-12 Unpacking Documents. So the recommendation is to approve these aspects of the supporting documents. SLA2 is
Ms. Chambers, I'm sorry.
Yes.
It's Mr. Ford. May I make a comment really quickly about the supporting documents?
Yes, quickly, Mr. Ford, please. So we usually have not much further discussion at this point.
No, I apologize. I just wanted to get on record in saying that I know part of the recommendation was to consider an additional preamble to the supporting documents, stating that America is a great nation. And I just wanted to offer a counter recommendation that we not do that, since that is categorically an evaluative statement. If one concludes that, our nation is really good but not great or above average, right? It does not make room for those considerations. And so to that end, I just want to get on the record as stating that I would like to offer a counter recommendation.
Is that going to be in the form of a motion or just a recommendation?
Take it under advisement. by
Take it
your
under
committee.
advisement? Okay, thank you. We will take that under advisement, Mr. Ford.
Yes.
So since the glossary isn't before us today, and I'm sorry, this is Amy White. Since the glossary isn't before us today, and those terms are used throughout the crosswalk and the strand maps, would it make sense to bring the entire item back next month after you've had a chance to do a revision or a more thorough look, that it comes to us in a package instead of separating?
Is Dr. Carlin, Dr. Stegall, or is there someone who could answer that question? I mean, off the top of my head, I would say it would still be very useful to teachers to have over the next month, but.
It's David Stegall. I would encourage, if possible, to move forward with the adoption of it, sans the glossary. If we could do that, teachers can begin working, and without it, it just, as we've heard from educators, it really puts them behind the eight ball. I do understand the need for the glossary for context, but having some of the other resources that are entailed benefit them greatly right now. Possible. Again, it's just my recommendation.
This is Maureen Stover, and if I could just reiterate what he said, as a teacher, the only time you really have to spend a substantial amount of your day doing planning and coming up with really fantastic activities and finding ways to differentiate instruction is during the summer. And the sooner we can get these supporting documents to our teachers to give them sufficient time to be able to develop those really robust and rigorous lessons, the better. So I think it would be fantastic if we were able to do the crosswalk today and then do the glossary next month.
Ms. Kamnitz, this is Olivia. I want to back up fully Miss Amy White's statement. I have no idea why. I have some thought about the holding off on the glossary for a month. At the same time, the other documents are driven by the glossary. The terms are sprinkled throughout. Therefore, if we are going to wait a month to make some decision around a glossary, which I was very clear in my comments yesterday, I have a number of opposing thoughts about the glossary. Number one, to admit that the terms are ambiguous and come from multiple perspectives is unfair to a second grader who needs clarity around terminology. So I would support Miss Amy White's. Her rationale is solid.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine.
Ms. Kamnitz. So earlier today, I made some comments about how everyone approaches issues with the best intent. And I think this is a perfect example of that we have a difference of opinion on moving forward on this issue, but people operating in good intent and everyone's heart is in the right place. I continue to believe that. And I think when we're making decisions such as this, it can sometimes feel like we're choosing between two sides when what we're really trying to do is to find the best path forward. If we had another board meeting in 1 week and we were able to get the citations for the glossary and to get the clarity that we needed, we wouldn't have to wait an entire month, and the implications for the field in terms of implementation of these standards and the crosswalk and the strand maps and the unpacking documents would not land squarely in the lap of teachers who are trying to plan for implementation in August. And so this is an issue where I do think time is of the urgency, and we do need to find a way to move forward with this. Is there any other option than us having to wait for July for us to rectify this issue with the glossary and the citations? Would just like to put that out there as a path forward, because I do believe it is the consequences of us not having additional time for our teachers to plan implementation of this, and for administrators to pull together summer planning and PLCs and the professional development necessary to implement this. The consequences of that are that we're essentially taking the summer months and we're chopping them in half, and we're saying, okay, at our July meeting, which I believe is July 8th, you all have now the green light to begin planning for implementation in August. It gives our teachers about 3 to 4 weeks for that to happen. So are there any other options in us having to wait for July for us to rectify this issue?
Perhaps we could try to get the glossary, if we have, if we do have the ability to have a meeting before the July meeting, we could have the glossary ready at that point and go ahead and vote today on the other one. Would be one option that I could see. I'm not sure whose call that is.
This is the superintendent, so I can commit to work with my team to have the glossary done in 1 week.
Could we, is that workable, Chair Davis, with our schedules?
See, we're already contemplating a
That's what I'm thinking.
June 18 or 21 special meeting. So now we're adding another one, right? That's what I'm hearing.
That's
Because the other item wouldn't be ready until, if I remember correct, yesterday's conversation, until close to June 18th.
My sense from the field is that June 18th would be a perfect compromise between today and July 8th.
And I would completely agree with Mr. Bristow Smith.
strong words from our others. Is that acceptable to you? I would change the recommendation for vote today.
Okay, so you're,
Well, no, I wouldn't change the recommendation for the vote. That's right. It would be the same recommendation. We would just approve all the documents on the table except for the glossary and then try our best to get the glossary.
It's not the issue. So,
Ms. Warren.
so would it be appropriate for me to make, a friendly, bring another motion to the table?
Yeah, when we get to this item for action, there's always an opportunity. We'll vote on this one separate. There's always an opportunity to issue a substitute motion, which takes precedent. The board votes on that. And then it goes, if that passes, then that's the motion that carries, or we go back to the main motion. Just to clarify, Ms. White, is it your desire to postpone the entire package until we have the glossary? Is that what your substitute motion will essentially?
It would be my desire to consider all of the items in one complete package as opposed to piecemealing, particularly because those keywords are used throughout all of the substantive documents that are part of it. And so I just think it would be better if we considered it as one piece.
Okay.
To Mr. Bristow Smith's point, the balance is those concerns versus the need for our teachers to go on and get their hands on as much of this as we can get. So,
Yeah, I guess the advantage of passing particularly the K-5 documents is then our elementary teachers can get going this week. But to Ms. White's concern, they're getting going on something that has a piece that hadn't yet been approved. I think that's the balance that we're seeking to strike here.
So the compromise is a June 18 vote at the called meeting
on the glossary.
on all of it.
The whole package.
Well, we're going to go ahead and do that, or is there going to be an amended motion?
My understanding is that Ms. White plans to make a motion at the correct time to delay the vote until the 18th.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't we proceed on? I mean, your committee will make a recommendation,
Yes.
and if it's different than Ms. White's,
Well,
we
we
might
have
have an
made a
opportunity to
recommendation.
put forth a motion and
Correct.
substitute, and we'll vote on that.
All right, thank you. Any other before I move on? SLA 2 is an SBE policy amendment, graduation certificates and participation for students with disabilities. This item is sort of part of a second step in a two-step process that was triggered by the new economics and personal finance course. We approved extended standards, I believe it was last month, and this is now an alignment of grad 010, policy grad GRID 010, to include 4 social studies credits, and add course titles to the graduation certificate policy. So Ms. Coltrane and Ms. McCoy brought us that. SLA 3 and 4 respectively are a request to begin revisions to K-12 science and healthy living content standards. This process is a 7 to 8 year process, and both of these subject areas are due to begin that process. So we'll be voting to approve for the staff to go ahead and begin that journey. SLA 5 is State Board of Education appointments to the Council on Educational Services for Exceptional Children. Ms. Thomas brought us this item. We have 2 people that we will be voting to reappoint, Diane Coffey and Christy Hutchinson. Action, we have SLA 6, which is the Governor's School Board of Governors appointment recommendations. We are recommending one name, that would be Lyndon Cummings, who I believe is a new appointee to the Board of Governors of the Governor's School. SLA 7 is the CTE entrepreneurial experience. And this adds the entrepreneurial experience as a 4th option for students who are seeking academic credit for aligned work-based learning in CTE. So it adds another wonderful option for our students who are interested in work-based credit and have that entrepreneurial bent. So a great opportunity for our students. Mr. Michael brought that to us. SLA 8 is North Carolina Academically and Intellectually Gifted Program Standards Update by Ms. Shaw Coltrane. And again, every 3 years, our districts are asked to update their AIG program plans, and anticipating that process next year, the staff has brought to us these revisions in the current AIG program standards. The changes provide clarity and reflect the division's call to action for equity and excellence in gifted education and the State Board of Education's resolution for equity and excellence. They support continuous program improvements in AIG programs and with the goal of maximizing learning for students. We talked about the perhaps incorrect understanding that seems to be out there in the field that this is somehow a threat to the existence of the AIG program. And we emphatically heard yesterday that that is not the case. It is required by law, and also I think for everyone around this table, absolutely what we know we need to provide for students. And as we pointed out yesterday, it's an equity issue for students who need individualized, who need us to meet them where they are, just as other groups of students do. So again, this strengthens our programs and provides guidance for districts who are interested in broadening the pool of academic and of identified students, but in no way reduces the size of that pool. Finally, we have 2 consent items. SLA 9, report to the General Assembly on schools for students. Sorry, let me make sure I get the wording to that correct. Report to the North Carolina General Assembly, schools for students with visual and hearing impairments. This is a required annual report to the General Assembly, which basically has to do with parents providing consent for students who are identified with primary disabilities of deafness and hearing impairment, deaf blindness and hearing impairment, the release of those students' information to DPI and directors of residential schools. So this is just a report on the number of parents who have given that permission. And then finally, SLA 10, another high school accreditation recommendation for Bertie Early College High School, which we heard has met all the school indicators that are required and are above the state average on all those indicators. So the recommendation would be to approve that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any questions on Student Learning and Achievement Committee report? Hearing none. So we have 2 items in the chair's report. First is the Report on termination agreement between the Innovative School District and Achievement for All Children. And based on advice from council, I'll read this announcement. You recall that last September, the board and Achievement for All Children entered into an agreement to terminate master operator agreement for convenience to terminate AAC's management of Southside Ashpo Elementary School. Okay. I tell you what, we're going to go on break. 'Cause I need some help with this before we go further. So it's 12:45. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 5 minutes till 1.